in essence, they created this dinner that featured the flavors of foods where the smells of the food were from microbes and typically human microbes.
Huh.
And so it allowed us a way to actually connect science and the subconscious. And in our collaboration, we wouldn't quite describe it that way.
Yeah.
But on the science side, there's that disruption where I can't quite do that.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. This episode is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. More about them later in the show.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. I am so thrilled to introduce my guest, Dr. Rob Dunn. He's the Senior Vice Provost of University Interdisciplinary Programs and a Reynolds Professor in Applied Ecology at North Carolina State University. As Senior Vice Provost, he oversees efforts to spur interdisciplinary scholarship, education, and public engagement at NC State. As a scholar, he studies the ecology and evolution of societies and the species with which they interact. This has included projects on the global ecology of sourdough bread, the evolution of sour taste, and the origin of yogurt microbes, among many others. Rob has published more than 200 peer-reviewed articles and more than 100 magazine and newspaper articles. He's published 7 books, including most recently, A Natural History of the Future, and with Monica Sanchez, Delicious, The Evolution of Flavor and How It Made Us Human. Rob, I'm so thrilled to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Great to talk to you. Always glad to talk about aesthetics and beauty and where it interfaces with science and the rest.
Fantastic. Well, were you drawn to biology as a child, or what drew you to become a scientist in the first place?
I was a kid who spent lots of time outside. I didn't know biology existed as a field. I caught snakes. My arms are peppered with little scars from snake bites as a kid.
Wow.
But I caught lots of fish. I had,
Where were you growing up?
In Michigan.
Okay.
But it wasn't a job, right? Like I grew up in a small town. I didn't know it was a thing. And so I went to college thinking I'd be an economist. It was a knowable thing. And I like the rules of economics, especially macroeconomics. Like it made sense, was intriguing. But I got to college and I met these people. There was a building of people with cages and nets and bones. And I didn't know who they were, but I knew that it was, somehow they represented an adult life that reconciled with my childhood.
Wow.
And so I got started, moving to biology and art, right? As an undergrad, I did lots of art, thought a lot about art.
Okay.
And so that was part of my work.
And were you able to integrate those as you went through your grad school and your further training, or did you have to cast your artistic side aside? Or?
It's a good question. So I would say it's sort of episodic. Like when I was a graduate student, they were separate but embodied by the same person, and so they would have these interfaces. And so at that time, a lot of my art was writing, and so I wrote a lot of poetry. And so I would write that on the lab computer, and it would come out the lab printer, right? And so, but it was separate. But I became part of that community at the university. I would submit things to the English department, ended up, going to dinners with the English department there. And so that was, They were contemporaneous. And I don't know what the two sides thought about each other, right? Other than that they existed, and my advisor gave me space for it.
Okay, great.
They weren't concretely informing each other.
Yeah.
And then at one point, and I'll try the short version of the story, but in my building, I studied the ecology of ants as a graduate student. And in my building, I knew there used to be a guy who studied army ants. And army ants don't make a nest of structures. It's a nest of their bodies. And there are all these hundreds of species and live with them and move with them. And so this guy, Carl Rettenmeier, had studied those species that lived with the army ants. And he was dead, but I was still in the department that he had been in. And then one day I'm walking down the hall and a door opens and there he is. And so I've got to process that somehow he's not dead. It turned out he was just emeritus. And he invited me to go with him to Costa Rica to study this beetle that only lives on one species of ant that he'd only seen once before in 1965. And nobody knew if the ant or beetle still existed. Okay. And so I was a grad student. Like I would go anywhere somebody was willing to pay. And so I went. And long story short, we go for 2 weeks looking for this and don't find it. We get home and realize we'd actually collected it and hadn't realized we'd seen it.
Wow.
And so hadn't filmed it, which was the whole goal of the thing, to film this rare Yeti ant. And for me, like, this was a story I knew how to tell. This was a story about how nature overcomes humans.
Mm.
You know, I grew up listening to stories about the Mississippi River, and so I wrote it down. And so it was creative nonfiction. I know, in retrospect, I didn't know what it was called then. And I sent it to an editor at the Natural History magazine, and they took pity on me and helped me with the story. But it was a key moment for me because it was a recognition that these two worlds had this connection point through creative nonfiction.
Yeah.
And so that started to connect these two worlds, and then they would come back together and then distance themselves. And then the visual art I wouldn't reconnect with for a long time, and that would mostly be through working with artists, which I didn't realize was a possibility until much later.
Okay. I want to ask you about the art science collaboration work. But before that, could you tell me where in your work you encounter beauty? Your work as a biologist, where does that word resonate with your experience?
So as an ecologist and evolutionary biologist, maybe there are two versions of that question, like where do I hear it? And then where does it resonate for me? But the way ecologists and evolutionary biologists talk about beauty is to talk about elegance. Is one of the places. And when they say that, they typically mean that a concept is elegant. And for a concept to be elegant, it can explain a lot of things in a simple way. And so math can be elegant, but that elegance is really a currency for us. And so if you look at what's funded, elegant work is really valued very highly. And in some ways, it doesn't matter if it's elegant. It needs to be true, but it doesn't have to be the most true thing. And so an example would be there's a beautiful study, using the word, by Tiffany Knight, where she showed that if you change the density of fish in a pond, that it changes the number of dragonfly larvae, reduce it. If you add fish, fewer dragonfly larvae, fewer adult dragonflies, fewer adult dragonflies that eat fewer bees. There are more bees, there's more pollination. And so that's a pretty famous study. And it's famous because it is a intricate but elegant example of a concept, which is the trophic cascade. And so to, my people, if I bring up this example, there's a response that's almost like the response you might get to a painting, there's something sublime in that elegance. And so that's very common currency in my world, but we don't ever talk about it that way. And we never talk about the fact that, is that good? Like, is that good for finding truth? Is that good for how we think about the world? And one of the interesting places that's a tension is that problems that intersect with human challenges are almost never elegant. And so if you look at the history of ecology as a field, there was a conscious attempt in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to remove humans. And it was conscious because the sense was like that was going to make it too complex and it was going to ruin the elegance of the work we could do. And so it's pretty juicy stuff right at the middle. And if I walk down, I'm in my building right now. If I walked down the hallway and talked about that Tiffany Knight study, people would go, ooh. But then if I said, let's talk about beauty, they would go, ooh.
Right.
We're not quite comfortable with what we're doing.
What is the source of the discomfort? Because is it that the word elegance is acceptable, but beauty isn't, or is there something else there?
Elegance connects us to mathematics, and so math can be elegant, and it's but also sophisticated. Beauty connects us to culture. It connects us to emotional responses. It connects us to pleasure. And we don't like that. That's
but it drives you all, right? It's the passion and the emotion, certainly.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other part I would say is for, at least historically for ecologists, most were motivated by some interest in the natural world. And so there's also a relationship to maybe beauty, but also sublimity, that there is a grandeur in the living world that is more than what we're measuring, and that can be terrible and wonderful. And that's something I don't see in the building. I only see it if I go into the field with people.
Right. Not in the lab, but
not in the There's a version in the lab. It's a different version.
Yeah. Yeah, we've heard scientists talk about just watching a particular mechanism or process unfold under a microscope, right? Sort of seeing that as sort of evoking the sense of the sublime that oh my God, it actually works like
Yeah,
this.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Could you talk about the art science collaboration work? I mean, I'm really intrigued by the work your lab's doing, and what is that work? How did it come to be, and why do you see it as important?
How does it come to be? I'm gonna have to think about while I talk because I'm trying to remember where it started. But my lab has worked with the public a lot, and so in that context, we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you most usefully engage the public and what do you want to trigger? What is the response you want? And for many years, we really failed at that.
Okay.
Because I would say most work that involves the public and science, there's not a concrete goal. It's like, well, the public, if there's a goal, it's some vague sense of education. And so we did a lot of work on skin microbes where we engage people with their skin microbes. And this probably isn't an origin story, but it's never trust a writer. But is that when we were talking to people about their skin microbes, my sense, like sort of 3 years into that work, is that instead of convincing people of the importance of those microbes and the importance of nurturing them in different ways, that I began to suspect we were triggering people to do the opposite. To be more likely to engage in behaviors that would destroy their microbiomes in ways that were to our collective detriment. That we were alarming them. And at about that same time, we began working with the artist Joanna Rissu. And she partnered with us to do the same sampling we were doing, but to do an intervention and she also does visual art in the context of this work, but the intervention was key. And the intervention was she would have people sample their belly button microbes. They would take a swab and sample them. We'd done this 1,000 times. But then she would ask them to talk to those microbes. What would they say to the microbes? And it invited this conversation that in 2 minutes triggered a more productive conversation about microbiomes than we had triggered in years of work.
Wow. And
so it was this unusual intervention, this conversation as intervention, which, Joanna then went on to do, visual art in response to it too, but that allowed us into a whole different world of work. And so we had a number of interactions like that with artists in the lab where I was like, well, something different is opening up through this art. It is allowing us to do something that we have been trying to do, but where we had proven incompetent. And our whole field was, in essence, being incompetent. And so the artists open up a new way of thinking and a new way of doing.
Right.
And the artists were universally, and so we work with Joanna, we work with Mila Green early on, work with artists thinking about time, working with Jonathan Keats right now. And so, but one of the recurring features is that the artist can disrupt things in ways that we don't have social permission to do.
Can you give me an example?
Well, so in that belly button case, like I can convince people to swab their belly buttons, and it's a little bit disruptive.
Yeah.
But I'm carrying out the science, right? Like I'm aware that I'm doing something that has a slight taboo to it. But you see, it's easy to see how it's science. And so I'm working within the bounds of my field.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, you can't tell people to talk to their microbes.
No, not on my own.
Yeah.
But Joanna allows me that. Or we work with a pair of artists called Baum and Leahy recently.
Okay.
And one of the things we've realized with microbiomes is that, in general, like we have a conscious relationship to microbes. Like if I ask you to tell me about your microbes, you have a conscious understanding of some parts of them. But we also have a subconscious or unconscious relationship with them. And the unconscious relationship is actually far richer. So your immune system is interacting with your gut microbes right now. It is feeding some, it is not feeding others. In your armpit, there are these glands that are feeding microbes right now. That's why armpits stink. Our olfactory system learns the smells of particular microbes, whether in food or on our body, and learns to like some and dislike others. And those are all these unconscious or subconscious relationships to these species. And we've never had a good scientific way to engage people in thinking about them. But we work with Baum and Leahy to do this dinner performance. In essence, they created this dinner that featured the flavors of foods where the smells of the food were from microbes and typically human microbes.
Huh.
And so it allowed us a way to actually connect science and the subconscious. And in our collaboration, we wouldn't quite describe it that way.
Yeah.
But on the science side, there's that disruption where I can't quite do that. And even if I were to try to do it, there's a boundary where I get uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But they
Right.
allow that discomfort, they give it a space, and then they can push the far end of it in a way I can't quite do.
So what's the goal there? Because I mean, initially you said you had this vague goal of education, and so it's not that, right? You're not just teaching them science. So what is it that you're trying to bring about together?
In those collaborations, each of us would have a different goal.
Ah.
And so for me, it's changing the conversation so we can start to do new kinds of work. For the scientist, to me, it is that, right? Like it's like, can we use this as a provocation to change what it is we're talking about?
Yeah.
Does this provocation allow me to talk with the people who do olfaction in a new way? Does the provocation trigger new conversations in the public sphere? The junior scientists who are involved in this work almost always still want to do that education piece. And I would say the artists really push back on that.
Okay.
Right? That there's an aesthetic challenge. There is an emotional challenge. Can we push the sublime? And so when it's working, I'm familiar with their goals and they're familiar with mine. But we're not necessarily agreeing.
Yeah.
We're just knowing that there is a sweet spot, and we're probably going to be one side to that sweet spot a little bit.
Sure, sure.
But that's okay.
So what does success versus failure look like in those collaborations?
I mean, the most obvious failure is it's boring.
Okay. Yeah.
Or it's there's a role for design, right? But if it feels like design, for me, that's a failure. Like design is interesting, but I want it to also provoke something new.
Yeah.
I mean, failure can be on my side. We make somebody really mad,
Okay.
right?
I mean, you'd also mentioned the sort of counterproductive aspect of the belly button thing initially, right? So if the reaction is that they're sort of withdrawing from the world or trying to sort of, destroy their microbiome or something like that, then that's
Yeah, that would be a failure too. That would be a failure too.
yeah, wow. What's next in that arena? Like where do you see that going?
Well, so that particular collaboration, I think there are going to be more iterations of it, and so it's inviting us to explore like what else could we do in that space. We neuroscientists now know that for individual smells of these individual foods, like there's a particular map on the olfactory part of the brain for each one of those. It looks like a constellation.
Wow.
And so is there some space for thinking about how we make the subconscious more apparent?
Yeah.
And so like there's something fun in there that, we'll keep talking through.
Yeah.
We're working with Jonathan Keats, who's an artist who focuses a lot on time. And so we have a collaboration in the food space there where we can take each city on Earth, and with Matt Fitzpatrick and other scientists, we can say what existing city, the future climate of that city is going to be like. And so for Raleigh, in 2100, it's cities like in Central Florida or the sort of Caribbean coast of Mexico.
Okay.
And so scientifically, like that's the science part. We've done it.
Yeah.
But the making meaning of that in a broader way, we have to think about culture and psychology and these other places, and like the art comes in there. And so, Jonathan is really leading us to think about what does this mean about the hybrid foods of the future? So what can grow around Raleigh in 2100? And what cultures are those foods associated with? And how do we confront our current food ways with these hybrid ways that are coming?
Yeah.
And we then get into these interesting spaces between the academic and the art where there's something that appeals to my aesthetic. And so in this case, like the high food version appeals to me. Like what's the high food, the cuisine that we could do? And on the artist side, Jonathan's really clear that like, no, like if we want to provoke a broader conversation, it's way more like hot dogs
Yeah.
or barbecue, like that it is these foods that are so tightly connected to culture that the provocation is bolder and means something different. And so that's useful to me too, to be reminded when I'm retreating to my aesthetic, my disciplinary aesthetic.
Yeah.
At the institutional level, we're trying to think about what does it look like to support these kinds of partnerships in a broader way? And I don't know yet.
Yeah.
Because they take a special kind of artist, and then they take scientific comfort with the uncomfortable things. They take a comfort with the recognition that the science on its own might not be doing what the world needs, And so I think if we try to do it institutionally in just this very structural way, like, I'm not sure it'll work.
Yeah.
And so how do we bring scientists to the table who are willing to be part of this conversation with artists who are also willing?
Yeah.
And I'm very interested in that question, and I don't know that I have an answer to it yet.
Yeah. What is the response from the scientific community, if there's any sort of response to this?
I think there's a response we're supposed to have, which is that, I think it's different in the U.S. Let's say that there's people feel compelled to say that the art is over here and that they're scientists and they're supposed to do science.
Yeah.
Very often, my writing life, I find that, like, when I go give a talk at a university, there's a group of people that come up and tell me about their secret novels at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I've never been to a university where that isn't true. And almost always, like, really filthy romance novels.
Okay.
Whatever that means. I think in the same way, there are lots of scientists who are really interested in art. And so it's there, but it's not part of their work world.
Yeah.
And so they've not connected those two elements.
Yeah.
I think in parts of Europe, it's quite different.
Right. Okay.
You're listening to Beauty at Work. This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. Templeton Religion Trust supports projects as well as storytelling related to projects that seek to enrich the conversation about religion. To learn more about them, visit templetonreligiontrust.org. This episode is also sponsored by the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, a global research center located at the University of Southern California. IACS works to create dialogue, spark ideas, and sustain academic research on Catholic thought, creative imagination, and lived experience. Learn more at iacs.usc.edu. If you're enjoying the show so far, please subscribe to our podcast and take a moment to leave us a review.
So what would you see as a good model for integrating this? I mean, what are the exemplars, or where, how would you, if you could wave a magic wand and change things here, what could that healthy integration look like?
I'll give you an example. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that in a big way, and I hope you can find it for me. But an example was, we had a bunch of scientists. We've pushed scientists here to think about the farther future, not just 5 years, but 10, 20, 50. And one of the things we see is that what scientists are most comfortable with is a technological future embodied in their discipline. They're comfortable talking about that, but they're not comfortable talking about where that sits in society.
Okay.
And so I think that might be a really healthy way for us to think structurally about some partnerships. And so what does it look like to get the scientists to think 10, 20, 30, 40 years in the future, and then to bring the artists in the conversation to think about, how do we think about this? I think that's one model. The other is, I'm working with speculative fiction writers some, and it's like usefully awkward. Like, we haven't figured out how to work together yet. But one of the things I see on the science side is that, we have the climate change scenarios that we talk about all the time. And so those are futures grounded in models, but they're alternate futures, right? In the same way that speculative fiction writers would think about alternate futures. But there's no humanity in them. They are futures that are entirely about emissions scenarios. And so people can't relate to them, right? They don't remember which one is which. And so it's like, well, how does it, RCP 4.5 relate to the society we're going to have?
Yeah.
And so we've had a bunch of conversations to think about, how do we bring writers into this? And I think that the way to make it work and come back in a year is to start with the writers and to have a group of writers partner with a scientist. And the writer's task is to imagine different, better futures, right? Like, not utopian necessarily, but we need help with the better.
Yeah.
But to have the scientists inform the possible.
Yeah.
And so we had a conversation a couple of weeks ago where I was pushing our geneticists who do genetic engineering to tell me, like, well, what does the possible look like?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of latent possible, like that they don't like to talk about. They don't get asked to talk about.
Sure.
And so one of the things that came up is like one of our very successful, really impressive scientists was like, well, I wake up all the time worried about the reality that within 10 years, we'll be able to extend human telomeres. And in doing so, allow people to live 200 or 300 years. And it really worries me who we are going to allow to live that long.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're not talking about that. Like,
Yeah.
we're having no conversations about that. And the speculative fiction writers aren't really writing about it. And so, can I create a structural way to pair the writers with these futures that are, I don't know the right word, Brandon, but implied by the technology or
afforded, I suppose, right? It's
afforded. Yeah, afforded is the right word.
Yeah.
Afforded by the technology.
Yeah.
Wow. And so I think it's going to be like people won't know how to work together, but my hope is like we can try enough versions of that that we could start to find a way.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think the ideal would look like?
No, I have no idea, but I was just punching to you. I mean, but I've been really curious as to this, how to overcome this two cultures problem, right? That C.P. Snow talked about, and the humanities and the sciences being in their own kind of silos, which I think figuring out ways to have these kinds of conversations where people work on things together in some way seems to be the right way to do it. I just haven't seen. Institutionally, I haven't seen any good models, right? So I think it's one thing to have initiatives like your lab. It's something else to have more conversation in, academic institution or across fields where there is this there's value to this. I don't know what the incentive structure would be, what the funding structure would be either. But I think you're raising some really crucial issues, right? To imagine the future, you need to know both the science and to have the artistic ability to do that. I mean, both.
Well put.
Yeah. I want to pivot a bit and ask you about a natural history of the future. I mean, I was really struck by the incredible resilience that you're showing in the book, the adaptability of nature. And I think at the outset, you have the megaplate experiment, which is, I wouldn't call beautiful in its implications anyway, but, perhaps it's good, fit for purpose. So it's beautiful in that sense, but certainly a very grotesque, horrifying kind of example. Could you talk about the example, why you started with that and what it means for the argument you're making?
Yeah, and I'll say that I think the aesthetic component of that experiment, I mean, it is a science experiment, but the aesthetic is really an important feature of it.
Yeah.
And so I'll describe it visually. I mean, it looks a little bit like a Rothko painting, right? So it's a giant petri dish. It's like a meter, I guess. And it's filled with agar, so bacteria can grow on it. And the agar is in columns. And at the end, the agar is just bacteria, food, and house, right? Like nothing else in it. And as you go toward the center, these Rothko painted columns have more antibiotic in them. Until you get to the middle, it's like a super toxic, apocalyptic concentration of antibiotic. And the experiment is about how fast the bacteria evolve resistance to the antibiotic. And so the bacteria are introduced in the end columns, and they can go toward the middle. And at the beginning, they have no ability to move through those additional columns because they're not resistant to the antibiotic. And so the only way for them to move through is to evolve resistance. And so what you see unfold in real time over 12 days, if memory serves, then you can fast forward to watch it sped up, is the bacteria very quickly go from that first column that's free of antibiotics to the second one with a low concentration of antibiotics. And many different individual little clumps of bacteria do it, reflecting that many times independently they're evolving the ability to move across into that next column. And so then they fill that next column. And not very long after, they move into the column after that, until very quickly the bacteria have evolved the ability to live in this toxic soup of antibiotics right in the middle. And for me, the aesthetic there is what makes that work. I would call it sublime. I think it's the terrible sublime. It is the same sucking sound as the universe, right? Like that there's something. But if it was a petri dish this big, visually you could show the same thing. But it's the awareness that this is a scale that's about the size of a human body that I think changes it.
Mm.
I think visually being able to see a process that we think of as being from deep time,
Mm.
like that's an aesthetic change. It's a change of a time frame.
Yeah.
In retrospect, they talk about a little bit the aesthetic features of this, and they were inspired by an advertisement sign to do this. But I think they were aware that what they were doing was partially about the science and partially about the aesthetics and the art.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to me, that it's actually a really intriguing case because there's not an artist involved. It is a provocation. And if I show it in a slide deck to an audience, it triggers a really strong emotional response. And so in that way, it happens to be science, but it is also in its power art,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I don't know. To you, did it strike you as art? Did it strike you as science? How did you
Yeah,
read
no,
it?
I think both certainly. Yeah, but I think I was more struck by the sense in which, we're trying to eliminate bacteria and we think we can do it and we can't. Right? I
Yeah.
mean, and that's the kind of just being struck by how indomitable nature is, right? I mean, it's just, and I think we have this conceit that we're not part of nature, right? That we think we're something outside of it. And there is that our ability to transcend it to some degree, but I think so much of our technology and even just the way in which we live our lives is premised on that conceit that we are above and not part of nature.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like Elon Musk, his gut microbiome came from his mom's body during birth, right? His bacteria on his skin are in an active evolutionary war with the viruses that attack those bacteria. His immune system is interacting with all the species around him every day, even if he pays no attention to them.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which like consciousness here is part of what distances us. All the stuff that we think of as sitting in our head. Meanwhile, the rest of our body is just disconnected.
Yeah.
And so like that disconnect is really fascinating to me.
Yeah.
That the body knows where it is. Like the body knows what it's missing in some level. And that our conscious brains are like, no, I'm in a room alone. There's no other species here. And if I draw a future, I'm going to draw fancy buildings and technology.
Right.
As long as we got enough engineers, we're cool.
Yeah.
He's like, yeah, turns out that's problematic.
That's not even who we are. Yeah. No, it's incredible. Yeah. I think, again, our discovering the microbiome and realizing we are actually more than just solitary individuals has been groundbreaking for a lot of people.
Well, and just to butt in, Brandon, like we've discovered it twice. We knew about it in 1909. And people who studied termites picked it up from people who studied humans. In 1909, we knew that babies were acquiring gut microbes from their moms during birth and they needed them.
Wow.
And we just ignored it for humans.
Wow.
Because, and my hypothesis would be it's so at odds with this Western sensibility of the lonely human out on their own.
Yeah.
John Wayne and the microbiome don't
That's right.
interact well.
So I want to ask though about that sort of solitary, the illusion that we have. So, one of the things we learned from the scientists we talked to is that most of them see science as essentially the pursuit of what we're calling the beauty of understanding. And so grasping behind patterns and appearances, the hidden order or inner logic of things, right? And that's really the business of science for most of them. And yet there are others who argue that, well, that's kind of a naive way to depict it. Science is really about violence. It's about conquest. So it's not really, even though scientists light up when they talk about discovery, there is the project of Western science is people would argue a violent project of conquest, man over nature sort of thing. I wonder what your reaction is to that. I mean, to what extent is science about violence or conquest? And I mean, particularly in relation to what you're arguing in your book, how should science proceed if that's really been the trajectory?
I mean, I think it's a yes and situation. That it would be interesting to imagine if we could create a system of scholarship at a national or global level that would work really differently. What would it work like?
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting thought experiment. Clearly, we need a system for making more sense of the world in order to act in the world. we've got a 10 billion person experiment going on that requires us to be able to control a huge proportion of Earth's resources for our benefit. I don't know another way to do that. I would also say on the positive and negative is too simple, but on the, for lack of a better frame, on the positive side, it is also the science that allows us to see our place.
Yeah.
To be reminded of that humility, if we're willing to be reminded. And so, I mean, to me, Western science is one of the most powerful reminders of how small we are in the context of the rest of the living world. But it is also a structure that reinforces our inability to notice that.
Yeah.
So formally, it's science that's told us there might be 1 trillion bacteria species, even though we only know 30,000. I mean, right now you're breathing in most of the species you're breathing in, no one's ever named or studied. Right. And that is a humble moment before the universe.
Yeah.
There's no structural element in Western science for humility. Humility is individual, not part of the system. And so I think that's an interesting feature. And then Western science sits atop this history of conquest, this history of religion. Scientists aren't terribly comfortable talking about the colonial parts of science. They're really uncomfortable talking about the fact that, Western science, the reemergence of Western science in the Renaissance context emerges in a religious context.
Right.
And so, even the names we have for parts of the university, like the provost, they're actually the religious names for these entities. And so, the whole scholarly endeavor is connected to that religious endeavor. And so, to me, there are lots of parts of this that should invite constant revision, but revision in light of how do we take where we are and what we need to do collectively, globally, and imagine a system that has better features. Because I think the wholesale critique, late at night I can embrace some of the wholesale critique of what we're doing, but in the morning I've still got to make a plan.
Yeah.
And so reconciling those elements, and there's an amazing, I'm going to forget a name right now, but the science and technology scholar at the University of Michigan, first name Shobita, and I'm going to forget Shobita's last name, unfortunately, but and she's done great work thinking about how would you reimagine the funding system to make the benefits of science more just. And so I think that's the other thing we can be doing is that this is not science is not this. It's not divorceable from the system, from the architecture of funding, from the architecture of who we value and why. And we can change that architecture, and so we can change our funding systems. And what would it look like to fund science in a way that made more sense? And I think that can be with regard to justice, with regard to equity, but it can also be with regard to being better at making discoveries, right? And so I think there's room for all those kinds of intervention.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a simple answer to that frame, but I think it's useful to be reminded that the same thing can be in search of beauty and connected to horror.
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's helpful. I want to switch again and talk about your other book, Delicious. And I was really thrilled to come across it because I've been also interested in exploring the role of beauty and food and hospitality. What drew you to write this book?
So my wife's an anthropologist, and maybe the first layer of what drew us to Monica Sanchez, my co-author, is also my wife, and so we were talking about that when we meet with scientists at dinner, they always talk about their science or anthropologists, their scholarship and food. Right? They connect at dinner all the time or at drinks, but it's secret. It doesn't seep into the daily life. And so it first started as just a way of telling these stories of what comes up at dinner when you talk to a primatologist about food.
Yeah.
And then as we started to write it, and so it was like this secret world, like let's share this kind of pretty fun secret that we've spent luxurious years traveling the world, meeting with clever people who want to talk about chimpanzees and food or these kinds of things. But then it became clear when we started talking to people about the book, there was a disconnection between pleasure and deliciousness. and how people study humans and non-humans and food.
Hmm.
And it was weird. And so it was an opening. And so on the one hand, like lots of ecologists and evolutionary biologists study, for example, hummingbirds and the choices they make, or vervet monkeys and the choices they make. But they talk about optimization.
Huh.
And so the implication is that those animals are robots and they have some way of perfectly making choices of what they need, and that's just caloric. And so that was interesting. Like, so there was something there. And then the other part was anthropologists who work with hunter-gatherers would do the same thing, but for different reasons, right? They would attribute to hunter-gatherers this sort of perfect ability to make choices, but they wouldn't allow them pleasure.
Right.
And so the book really emerges as a way of saying, well, if we recenter pleasure and deliciousness, does this do some work in allowing us to understand the human story? And then it turned out that, yeah, it was actually a useful way to look at all of these moments in human history and evolution. But it was also interesting how uncomfortable people were talking about it.
Right. What is the source of the discomfort there, do you think? Is it because it's typically dismissed as, well, this is just a sort of banal type of pleasure? It doesn't really, it's not particularly meaningful, or, we could do without this. I mean, where's the discomfort coming from?
I don't know. I'll speculate that pleasure seems frivolous.
Yeah.
Pleasure is a bougie part of the world, right? And so, like, to take a bougie part of the world and attribute it to a hummingbird.
Yeah.
It's also that the people who study the different parts of it are not the same people.
Yeah.
And so the people who study hummingbirds in the field are not the ones who study taste receptors or olfaction. And they don't know each other.
Right. Wow.
Right. They've never met.
Yeah.
The field people, on some level, they know that the hummingbird is making a choice and it must use senses to make a choice. And if you push them, they would say, well, of course, it's choosing the thing it prefers. Well, then what does a preference mean?
Yeah.
It means it's pleased by that thing, right? That's embedded in the language.
Yeah.
But they don't know the science, and so they don't have a way in. And then the science behind pleasure has also advanced a lot in a couple of recent years. And so, like, that maybe is a piece of it.
Yeah.
But as an example, like, we started in writing the book, to study sour taste. And it turned out there was not a single paper that tried to explain the evolution of sour taste at all. Like, zero. I mean, 3 sentences in a paper here, 2 sentences there.
Wow.
And so that was a pretty concrete example of, like, what we're missing. Like, all vertebrates have sour taste, and we've not even started to try to explain its existence.
Wow. I mean, it's just super fascinating. I mean, I think I've been really interested in the relationship between flavor and taste and memory, right? I mean, so culturally, that's just critical for. I mean, you think of even works of literature like Proust. I mean, those are central moments where you have that kind of connection between a smell and certainly the memory. But what did you learn in your book? I mean, I imagine your household conversations must be super fascinating between a scientist and an anthropologist. But how does this relationship between the evolution of our taste relate to the development of cultures and societies? Because there's all sorts of rituals that evolve around the preparation of food and the way in which what foods go together, what foods need to be kept separate, and how is that related to our sense of taste?
Yes, good question. I've got a partial answer. And so if we think about, imagine a time before language, for which chimpanzees are not a exact replica, but they are a proxy of some elements. So one of the fun things about a book like this, and it's like your podcast, the same kind of thing, right? You get to connect people who don't know each other. You get to draw these threads across. And so what chimpanzee people know is that people who study chimpanzees know is that chimps have culture, and that culture is almost all attached to food. Very few cultural phenomena associated with chimps that are not related to food, and that they're arbitrarily different. And so chimps and 2 populations eat different things, not because there are different things there, but because it's their culture. And we know that in some cases that's persisted for thousands of years because there are chimp archaeological sites.
Wow.
Or there's at least one that records. The archaeological site includes a stone that the chimp was using to smash a nut on another stone.
Wow.
And that's, if I remember right, it's 2,000 years old. At that same site, the chimps still do that. And so that's a really persistent culture.
Yeah.
And what the primatologists have struggled with is, how do the chimps pass that culture on without words? And they have word-like utterances, which do for some things, like this fruit is delicious. Like, it works for that, right? But it's not good for, like, well, you break the stick here and then you stick it in. But what the primatologists didn't seem to know is that in the olfactory world, it's been known for a while that olfactory learning starts in utero. And so if your mom eats something, you're born liking the smell of that thing.
Wow.
And so you're learning a noun, in essence, and you're learning a preference or a lack of distaste for that noun.
Huh.
And so it's Proust Madeline, but it's in utero version.
Wow.
Right. I am remembering that my mother liked Madeleines.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a good art piece, right? Because I think the artists are also not aware of that.
Yeah.
What do you do with that in literature would be interesting.
Yeah.
But it then allows the chimps a way to pass on a preference without ever saying anything. And so if you like to eat this ant species, your baby likes to eat it without you ever showing the baby the ant species.
Right. Wow.
And then when the baby watches you get that ant, it already prefers it. And so I think a first layer of this is that connection between culture and olfaction and the learning part of olfaction. And just to put two words on the table, so taste, I think of as the taste receptors on the tongue, and they're dumb. Like, they're just positive or negative. Most of it's not learned.
Yeah.
But flavor is all the olfactory things and the mouthfeel and the taste.
Right.
And that has tons of learning associated with it. And so then fast forward from that pre-verbal world to a world in which we're still moving around the world, we're learning new places, but we can also use stories and language to reinforce some of these things and to pass them on in new ways. And then you get the possibility for elaboration in infinitely beautiful and different ways.
Yeah.
Set atop these ancient pieces.
Yeah.
But there's almost nothing written about that.
Right. Wow. Well, I'm really glad you've embarked on this. I was also struck by the way in which you talk about the evolution of spices and the use of spices and the kind of was it benign masochism, right? In reference to the use of, say, chili peppers. I mean, I'm in of Indian origin, and my wife's a white American, and we've we've struggled around the use of chilies and spicy food in our household, and training children to eat chilies. And my wife's always sort of surprised as to how would anyone even begin to start consuming this kind of food. It seems as though there are other ways in which our pursuit of beauty leads us to tolerate discomfort or pain, right? Like bodily piercings, stilettos. There's all sorts of things that we...
Scary movies, right?
Yeah.
Like yeah.
Is it the same mechanism then for the preference for spicy food? Or is it is that the same kind of is what's driving the development of that kind of taste, which is pleasurable but requires enduring pain? The same, you think, across other kinds of adaptations like this?
You mean beyond the pain
of taste? Yeah, like so is our preference for spicy food like our willingness to get tattooed or wear stilettos or something like that?
Yeah, I think psychologists, I think, would argue that they're related, and that they build on the need to know that the danger is not real or that it's modest.
Mm-hmm.
And the few cases where non-human animals engage these dangerous things, like this spicy food, for the subset for whom the spicy peppers are spicy, if they trust the individual giving them the food, they react differently to it than if they don't.
Okay.
And so in some way that trust seems to encapsulate a knowledge that this is not actually dangerous.
Right. Yeah.
And so you're courting the danger. And then there are these, really heightened versions of it where maybe there's actually a little bit more danger, like fugu, that culture can push in a really accentuated way, but I think it's built on that same framework.
Yeah.
I think often in culture you get these overlaps. Like there's a culture meets psychology piece, but it might overlap with a culturally adaptive piece. And so with spicy foods, if you're if you're being pleased by that danger, but it also is helping to preserve the food,
Yeah.
you've got this connected benefit. And so you have two levels of reinforcement.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's fascinating to me the ways in which we culturally have figured out to trick our really simple ancient brains.
Yeah.
But without being aware of what we're doing.
Yeah. No.
We're all complicit in these faux dangerous things, but not very conscious of, well, what are you actually doing with that, right? Like you like the idea of running from a leopard without actually having to run from a leopard. And if you can get a little bit of that in this very domesticated way, but then in our everyday context, we're not even thinking about why is this part of what we're doing.
Yeah. And then, and then the meanings we build around it are really interesting, right? I mean, I remember there's an occasion when I had one of my relatives, this was in Kuwait a few years ago, we went to visit them and they had served us, I think goat or something. And it was very heavily spiced. And they'd asked my wife, how would your family prepare something like this? And she would talk about, well, we'd just grill it on the grill. And he's like, with no spices. I mean, that means you would have to taste the meat. Why would anyone want to taste the meat? Yes, you want it to be saturated with flavor. Was the argument, right? And how does it make us human? What is the way in which? I mean, that's the subtitle of your book. But this is.
Yeah, so if we think about like the big evolutionary changes in our history, I mean, one goes back to sort of our common ancestors with chimps when culture is evolving. And it's clear like all the evidence we see of culture in non-human primates is around food and flavor. It's about eating delicious things. And so there's not another argument for why those cultural things evolve. You might say, well, it's to get calories.
Yeah.
But which is also true, but the proximate reason the chimps are doing it is because it tastes good. And they eat plenty of things that just taste good and don't give them anything they need. Right. And so I think there's an argument for culture emerging in the first place in the context of flavor and deliciousness. If you look at, there's a big evolutionary transition like 1.9 million years ago when our ancestors evolved bigger brains, smaller teeth, shorter guts. It's a huge transition that, it's this key moment in our prehistory. And the paleoanthropologists will fight brutally, passive aggressively over what the cause was. But they all agree it was somehow processing a new food. And everybody Monica and I talked to also agreed, well, yeah, the new food will be tastier.
Yeah.
And so taste was bound up in that transition. So if it was about cooking, well, the reason you cook is not because you think, well, I'm optimizing my caloric intake by releasing more pre-verbal ancestors. It's because it tastes delicious.
Yeah.
And so it's just, adding that back into this story, like to recognize that there was a choice in that moment. And so as you go through, our ability to make sense of new landscapes was in the context of our sensory preferences and our pleasures and our displeasures. And so what we try to reconstruct in the book is that for most of these key moments in human evolution, pleasure was featured.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't the whole story.
Right.
But it was this really proximate piece of that decision making.
Yeah.
And so it's to kind of also lift it up provocatively. And, maybe we're wrong in some of these cases and somebody can push back. But it's not even something we're talking about yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy for the,
Yeah.
We talk a lot about cheese, and maybe the cheese story is wrong, but maybe not. We'll see.
That's fantastic. There's so much more I'd love to talk to you about, but I want to be mindful of your time. And where can we send our viewers and listeners to learn more about the work you're doing?
Just go to the Rob Dunn Lab. So if you just type that in, you'll get us. But I also say to your viewers and listeners, I mean, I'm really keen to continue to think about what it means to think about aesthetics and science, what it means to partner with artists. And so one of the luxurious parts of my job is that we get to look for big, bold ideas and think about how we implement them. And so I'd love to hear big, bold ideas about what a reimagined interface between art and science looks like. And we're working hard on it, but per my response to your question, we don't know exactly how to do it yet. And so if people have ideas, I'm really receptive to what a different future might look like.
Yeah, amazing. I think it's super crucial. I'm so glad you're doing this work. And thank you again for joining us today.
Well, and thanks so much for this series and the work you're doing. It's hidden, this interface, but so important. Thanks, Brandon.
Great. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out our show notes for more resources from our guest. And if you like this episode, please be sure to share it with your friends. And please leave us an honest review. We'd love to hear what you think, and it helps to get the word out about our show. Music for the show was provided by Venkat Subramanian, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. And thanks again to our two sponsors, Templeton Religion Trust and the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. To learn more about our research project on beauty and science, visit wellbeinginscience.com. To learn more about our broader project on beauty at work, visit beautyatwork.net. Thanks again, and see you next time.